quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I would like to now recognize myself for an opening statement. The Western Hemisphere possesses tremendous opportunities for further economic growth and U.S. business engagement. The United States already has significant economic interests in Latin America and the Caribbean, and is the largest single source of foreign investment for many countries. We are also the top trading partner for most countries in the region and have free trade agreements with 11 countries and bilateral investment treaties and international investment agreements with 19 countries in the region. Yet, we are seeing hedging in the region from some countries that don't always play by the rules, which undermines U.S. economic interests. China has significantly increased its outreach to Latin America and the Caribbean, offering less stringent investment conditions and pledging $250 billion in investment over the next decade. However, it accounted for just 1.1% of foreign direct investment in Latin America and Caribbean in 2016, compared with the United States investment at 20%. I'm particularly interested in the future of U.S. economic engagement with the Pacific Alliance countries of Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. These countries adhere to market-oriented policies, and taken together, they represent 39% of Latin America's gross domestic product, offering U.S. businesses huge opportunities for greater investment and trade. Chile, Colombia, and Peru are among the world's most open economies, with almost no restrictions on foreign ownership. Half of the 32 economies in the region also implemented at least one regulatory reform in the last year alone, making it easier for the U.S. companies to do business. Notably, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico have made serious energy reforms, opening their sectors to investors, making it easier to do business. The Northern Triangle countries have also taken steps to attract foreign investment by creating special economic zones and working to integrate their markets. In the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic and Jamaica took actions last year to improve their business climates as well. Ecuador now has new political leadership and has announced its intention to advance more market-oriented policies and address rule of law, press freedom, and regulatory framework issues. I think there is potential for change in Ecuador, as Ecuador, El Salvador, and Panama all use the U.S. dollar. American businesses have obviously some unique investment opportunities in the region. Colombia was recently invited to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and other Latin American countries are interested in joining the OECD as well, which may motivate further reforms. While all these opportunities seem promising for the region, countries continue to face rampant corruption and impunity, high levels of crime and violence, inconsistent application of the law, with some laws and policies changing from week to week, burdensome regulatory frameworks, unclear tax structures, a lack of transparency and accountability in government processes, and central banking system that make U.S. business investment difficult. Limited digitization and technological innovation, preferences for cash payments over credit, labor regulations and high levels of unemployment, and foreign restrictions on foreign equity ownership also increase U.S. investment challenges. I've heard from multiple U.S. companies who want to expand their presence, create more jobs in the region, which will lower migration to the United States. and invest in communities where they operate. However, these investment challenges have made some U.S. businesses think twice about long-term investment. Presidential elections in Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil in the coming weeks and months may also shift political priorities, presenting additional obstacles to increased U.S. investment in the region and providing tremendous opportunities. I want to close by recalling the 57 points in the Lima commitment that countries agreed to at the Summit of the Americas in April to reinforce democratic governance and anti-corruption measures. It is my view that U.S. businesses play a critical role in raising standards in the region. And in my conversation with regional leaders at the summit, it was clear to me that countries see the United States as their partner of choice. I believe that our government, State Department, could be doing more to advance U.S. business engagement in the Americas. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues. With that, I will turn to our ranking member for his opening statements. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all our witnesses for joining us today. Today, we're here to talk about opportunities and challenges for American businesses around the Western Hemisphere. I have long said that the U.S. can and should be doing more to enhance engagement with our friends in the Western Hemisphere. Deepening our economic ties is one of the best ways to improve relations, create jobs, and bring us closer to our neighbors. We should work together to make sure that the United States is the preferred partner of choice of our allies. A large part of that engagement is making sure that all companies invested in the hemisphere are playing by the same rules. Ensuring rule of law, consistency, and stability is key to having a climate that fosters economic growth and creates jobs. American businesses can help strengthen democratic values by promoting best practices for labor rights, environmental standards, and transparency in financial management. That is just one of the reasons so many in the region have been working to promote anti-corruption initiatives like the CSIG and the MACI around the region. These anti-corruption efforts promote transparency and stability, two key ingredients to economic development. Unfortunately, we see politically motivated attacks against these efforts every day, weakening anti-corruption institutions only to hinder economic growth and prevent job growth. It is this economic growth and security that can also tackle the root causes of migration, preventing families from fleeing their homes in dangerous conditions in search of a better life. Sadly, corruption and security issues aren't the only obstacle to advancing U.S. investment and trade in the Americas. Both the rhetoric and the decisions made by the Trump administration are putting U.S. businesses and jobs at risk. Bombastic comments insulting our friends and allies does nothing but make U.S. seem like an untrustworthy partner. Imposing punishment tariff raises the cost of doing business for everyday Americans and drives uncertainty and instability, while China is investing billions and building inroads throughout Latin America. The president is busy punishing our friends to play to his political base. He's practically driving the rest of the world into the arms of the Chinese. At every turn, the president threatens to end agreements or blow up trade negotiations. This is no way to protect American jobs, American families, or American interests. I am eager to hear from the witnesses how they feel the administration's recent actions and their impact on U.S. businesses abroad. I look forward to hearing what Congress can do to promote American investment and best practices around the region. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, I'm going to explain the lighting system in front of you. You each have 5 minutes to present your oral statement. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow. And when your time has expired, the light will turn red. I ask that you conclude your testimony once the red light comes on. By the way, I used to dream about strange things. Now I dream about these lights at night. And I'm sure you do too, after all the testimonies that you've been. Anyway, after our witnesses testify, members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity to ask questions. Our first witness to testify will be Mr. Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. Prior to this, Mr. Farnsworth worked at the U.S. Department of State in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and was appointed as the Senior Advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas. Our second witness to testify is Mr. Neil Harrington, the Senior Vice President for the Americas at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Harrington also serves as Executive Vice President of the Association of American Chambers of Commerce in Latin America and the Caribbean, the acronym AACCLA. If you can pronounce that one, you get extra points. Prior to joining the Chamber, Mr. Harrington worked at the State of California Office of Trade and Investment, the U.S. Trade Representative, Raytheon, and General Motors. And our last witness to testify will be Ms. Kelly Mayman Hawk, a managing partner at McClarty Associates. Prior to this, Ms. Hawk worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, served as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Inter-American Dialogue. Mr. Farnsworth, you are now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Ranking Member and members. And before I start with my testimony, may I congratulate you on your opening statements. Those were powerful, and we look forward to responding to some of the questions that you've put out there already. It's a privilege to appear before you again in this subcommittee. The news that the Trump administration has decided to move forward with steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as Europe, with the possibility of additional future tariffs, coupled with cancellation of U.S. participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and an aggressive effort to reformulate and recast NAFTA, have roiled hemispheric trade and economic relations. These actions have introduced a significant element of uncertainty into the trade and investment calculus, along with the normal and anticipated emerging market risks in Latin America and the Caribbean Basin. And increasing uncertainty is, to be blunt, bad for business. As the United States retrenches, others are quick to fill the void, with China in the lead. China would still be a major presence in the Americas, of course, as it is in other emerging markets globally, even under a more traditional U.S. approach to trade. But Washington's recent actions are accelerating pre-existing trends. We may soon reach an inflection making impossible a return to the status quo ante. Within this framework, absent a policy shift, there are nonetheless any number of things that can be done to advance U.S. commercial interests in the hemisphere to the extent that we're inclined to prioritize them. The first is simply to be present. The Vice President's announcement Monday that he will soon travel to the region for the third time in less than a year is very welcome news. And effective commercial diplomacy also requires that the United States have diplomats and senior officials in place to promote our interests day to day, including the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Personnel are policy, and it's difficult to have an effective policy or to advocate for U.S. business without strong people in place. Second, we should refrain from affirmatively taking steps that would actually reduce the regional U.S. business presence. A perfect example is the ongoing effort to excise investor-state dispute settlement provisions within NAFTA, which would cause U.S. energy and other investors to reevaluate their investment plans going forward. Rule of law remains imperfect in Mexico, as it does across much of the region, and investors will be less likely to commit significant additional resources without greater judicial certainty. But Mexico's hydrocarbon reserves will remain, thus opening the door wider to greater sectoral investment from China, Russia, and other extra-regional actors. The same is true with other provisions being pushed by the United States in ongoing NAFTA negotiations, including dispute resolution, government procurement, and a 5-year sunset clause. Third, as the region develops alternatives to the United States, we have to contend more actively for regional commerce. Competition is fierce, and we must, as a result, compete. But unless Washington is willing to engage with the region broadly on the basis of true partnership, we will lose ground to others with a different approach. I also believe that we need to get a better handle on how our scarce aid resources are spent. Indeed, we should increase rather than decrease foreign assistance. And we should use such assistance to prioritize trade facilitation and business climate reforms, working with Latin American and Caribbean partners to address insufficient infrastructure, weak rule of law and anti-corruption, inadequate workforce development, and deteriorating personal security, among others, would help create conditions attractive for greater U.S. commercial engagement and sales. Finally, we face a challenge from China and other nations who use development finance more effectively than current authorities allow the United States to do. We need to up our game in this area. Prompt passage of the BUILD Act, for example, establishing an enlarged and enhanced U.S. International Development Finance Corporation would help address this, and there are other good ideas out there as well. Mr. Chairman and members, thank you again for the invitation to appear before you in the subcommittee today, and I look forward to having the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harrington, you are now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, Ranking Member Cidas. I think I would echo Eric's comments. I think you both framed our discussion today very, very well as we move this conversation forward. Among the multiple bilateral business councils and initiatives we operate, the Chamber is proud to be home to the 50-year-old Association of American Chambers of Commerce of Latin America and the Caribbean, or ACLA, that's the acronym. It is a mouthful. As we discuss ways to improve the economic climate in the Americas for U.S. investment, it's no exaggeration to say that ACLA is its face. The 24 AmChams across the hemisphere that comprise ACLA's network boast 20,000 member companies that collectively account for more than 80% of U.S. investment across the region. For years, ACLA member companies have identified weak rule of law as the #1 challenge facing U.S. companies doing business in the region. In response, the Chamber has been at the forefront of promoting adherence to rule of law as key to government's ability to increase investment and trade and help drive sustainable economic growth throughout the region. To bring greater attention to the importance of rule of law, 5 years ago, the Chamber's Americas program developed the Global Business Rule of Law Dashboard. What was once a regional initiative today covers 70 markets around the world and tracks 5 core factors critical to business success: transparency, predictability, stability, accountability, and due process. We have found that where these factors are present, investment thrives, economies grow, jobs are created, and prosperity follows. Conversely, in markets where these factors are weak or absent, corruption thrives, informality reigns, investment dollars flee, and tax revenues plummet. In December, we published the 3rd edition of the Global Business Rule of Law Dashboard, and one of its key findings was that the Americas region is lagging significantly behind, earning the lowest average score of any region in the world. In spite of this, there are reasons for optimism. The Odebrecht scandal, perhaps because of its sheer audacity and scope, has had a silver lining. It has helped galvanize the attention of both the region's leaders and citizens on the need for urgent action. Issues of impunity are being addressed as the Latin American political and business class are being held accountable for the first time in recent memory. As countries across the region carry out elections for new leaders, in 2018, we are also seeing hundreds of millions of citizens prioritize candidates' commitments to rule of law. And just 2 months ago at the Summit of the Americas in Lima, the region's governments underscored the imperative of regional adherence to the rule of law by making democratic governance against corruption the overarching theme of the event, as you acknowledged, Mr. Chairman. The Chamber was proud to be in Lima, serving as the U.S. Secretariat for the Americas Business Dialogue, or ABD, an initiative that seeks to advance a high-level public-private dialogue on regional economic development. Integral to this year's efforts were recommendations the ABD put forward to the regional heads of state, demonstrating the private sector's commitment to promote transparency and integrity in business dealings throughout the region that included adoption of comprehensive corporate codes of conduct, regional implementation of good regulatory practices, and commitment to permitting best practices certification for public officials. While developments like these are encouraging, they're only a start. Many challenges remain. We remain deeply concerned about Venezuela, where Maduro's tyrannical regime must be held accountable, as well as the growing crisis in Nicaragua, where the Ortega regime continues to flaunt the rule of law. Areas like the Northern Triangle of Central America remain plagued by violence, insecurity, corruption, and threats to democracy. In short, when it comes to strengthening hemispheric adherence to rule of law, the stakes for the U.S. and all countries in the region are enormous. Also imperative is the need for the U.S. to maintain its leadership in promoting a rules-based global trading system in our hemisphere that strengthens rule of law and provides a level playing field for American companies. We should not cede our leadership on trade in the region, and instead need to expand our economic and commercial engagement. The stakes are too high to do otherwise. One need look no farther than Canada and Mexico, which are the two largest markets for U.S. exports that together support more than 14 million U.S. jobs. That is why the status of NAFTA negotiations is of such great concern to the Chamber and our member companies, and we've been very vocal about that. Beyond the sheer enormity of the North American economic relationship, the outcome of NAFTA impacts U.S. policy across the Americas, which is home to 12 of the 20 FTA partner countries that the United States possesses, and is a destination for close to 45% of U.S. exports. Just like with rule of law, certainty in trade policy is key to success. We are facing uncertainty and potential division with allies at precisely the time when certainty and collaboration are required to confront a challenge to U.S. regional trade leadership from China. The Chamber shares many of the administration's concerns with China's unfair trade practices and industrial policies. But that said, global steel and aluminum tariffs do little to address the real issue of Chinese overcapacity. Instead, they risk alienating some of our strongest global allies at precisely the moment when a coordinated global strategy to counteract China's trade and industrial policies is needed. The U.S. government needs a robust strategy to help U.S. companies counter the growing economic influence in the region. With this, I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here today, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Ms. Mayman Honk, you are now recognized.
Thank you so much.
Did I pronounce that correctly?
In Spanish, yes, Mayman Haq, but in English, Mayman Haq.
Anywhere in between, so I
all
don't
good. I
offend
answered
anybody?
it all. I answered it all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Cires, and the rest of the distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify here today. Economically, 14 million American jobs depend on trade with Canada and Mexico. By far, these are the largest export markets for the United States. Rather than offshoring to Asia, critical supply chains have remained in North America, enhancing our ability to compete. Keeping state, commerce, and USTR fully funded in appreciation of the importance of commercial diplomacy is a strategic imperative, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. Ensuring that U.S. companies, from traditional manufacturing to agriculture to services to high-tech, can access markets, are fairly treated, can compete effectively for government contracts, and have their intellectual property protected are key aspects of commercial diplomacy. The U.S. has long reinforced the need for transparency and commitment to rule of law, and countries' desire to attract U.S. investment has often motivated economic reform. Membership in the WTO, achieving a free trade agreement, or OECD accession have provided further motivation to improve investment climate. However, we find ourselves at a moment today where U.S. credibility to speak on the importance of compliance with WTO and FTA commitments is at an all-time low. Positing that Canada, our longtime ally in conflict after conflict, creates a national security threat to the United States due to its steel and aluminum sales here, particularly if you consider that the United States has a $2 billion surplus with Canada on those same items, is nothing short of incredible. The equivalent charge against Mexico under Section 232 is equally difficult to understand given our long history of collaboration on security, counter-narcotics, and anti-terrorism. The initiation of a national security investigation on autos last month further diminishes U.S. standing. This action opens the door for our trading partners to limit U.S. exports of virtually anything in the name of national security. Global concern over food security leaves U.S. farmers at risk, to say nothing of U.S. technology companies in an era of digital warfare. So instead of successfully modernizing the NAFTA last week, the United States initiated a trade war, one which seems to have snatched the possibility of a successful NAFTA reboot from our grasp, at least for now. Mexican and Canadian retaliation are already in train. U.S. farmers, ranchers, and factories depend on exports to Canada and Mexico, and they will suffer. Beyond the impact on NAFTA, our actions have sent a stark signal that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. To be clear, concern over the misguided use of Section 232 and unilateral trade actions should not be a partisan issue. If these were policies that actually helped the American farmer and worker succeed, you would see overwhelming support from both sides of the aisle. This is not the case. My concern is that the United States is damaging its ability to forge new commercial agreements and to enforce existing ones through this behavior. Should the president decide to withdraw from NAFTA, the U.S. government's ability to positively impact investor climate in the Americas will deteriorate further, leaving the field open for Chinese and other investors and further damaging U.S. credibility. I would argue forcefully for regaining that credibility, with the U.S. Congress standing up against the policies that are leading to a deterioration of U.S. alliances. This is how we can rebuild our ability to defend U.S. economic interests. In the meantime, however, as the chairman noted, we may leverage OECD accession to pursue U.S. business goals in the Hemisphere, given the high number of countries that are currently pursuing membership. The U.S. should insist applicants meet the OECD's high standards through enactment of needed reforms prior to granting accession. Some opportunities to do so, if I may say, were missed in Colombia's case, given the haste to issue the OECD invitation in the waning weeks of the current administration. It will be important that we not repeat that mistake in the case of Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. In my written testimony, I covered priority areas to be evaluated in OECD accessions, including tax, customs, and regulatory policy, as well as rule of law considerations. I would highlight that across the region, and as Neil noted, we find renewed zeal for tackling corruption. At the same time, overregulation and poor implementation of these efforts can inadvertently stifle enterprise and destroy the formalizing role of U.S. companies with high compliance standards. Central American countries are at a particularly critical moment in this anti-corruption battle. My written testimony addresses some concerning activities in Guatemala, despite progress being made there. U.S. and multilateral technical assistance is crucial to ensure collaboration with the private sector to expand formality and bring violators to justice. In closing, I would stress the critical role that the U.S. government can and should play to promote a level playing field and rule of law throughout the Americas. I would urge this committee to take affirmative steps to persuade the Trump administration to put American farmers, ranchers, and workers first, dissuading the administration from taking further unilateral positions on trade and investment that prevent the United States from opening overseas markets and promoting rule of law in the Americas and beyond. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is I will yield myself 5 minutes to ask questions. By the way, Mr. Harrington, I don't know if you know it or not, but I used to be involved with the Chamber of Commerce, and it was always difficult to raise money. And I don't know if it's appropriate if you want to sell raffle tickets for a copy of this hearing. That's something we used to do many years ago. But
What are the rights on C-SPAN going for?
anyway, as I said, I will yield myself 5 minutes, and I want to raise an issue that I've been personally engaged on over the last several months. I've encouraged the Peruvian governor or government to resolve the claims of many of my constituents who have invested in Peruvian agrarian reform bonds, commonly known as land bonds. This issue directly impacts a large pension plan in San Bernardino County and thousands of my constituents. It's my understanding that the Peruvian government has suggested that it does not have an obligation to pay the debt now because it was issued over 50 years ago by a communist regime, even though the Peruvian Supreme Court authorized the sale or transfer of these bonds on the secondary market and ruled in 2001 that the government must compensate bondholders in an amount equal to the current value. So, are you aware of any precedent or tenet of international law that would excuse a government from its responsibility to pay debt if it were issued over 50 years ago, or if it were initially only given to Peruvians but later authorized for a secondary sale? And I'll throw it open to the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can take that question. I'm not a lawyer, but I did conduct trade negotiations at USTR, and I know that there are very clear investment obligations under our free trade agreement with Peru. I also understand that in the case that you've noted, there are numerous court decisions stating the contrary to the position that you're saying that the Peruvian government has put forward. And I guess I would hearken back to my testimony and only urge that in the consideration of OECD accession for Peru, which they are quite interested in, I understand, that this issue, as any issue that involves rule of law and transparency, be fully addressed before accession is taken place, as opposed to after.
Yeah, I hope you can see where I'm coming on this because, my opening speech, I talked about how important it is, trade, this and that, and then overseas investment. And this kind of sends a signal that's completely contrary. And obviously, since I represent San Bernardino County, as does my colleague, this is something that we get questions about and we're concerned about. Anyone else want to comment on this? No? Okay, with that, I'm going to yield. My time has expired, and the ranking member, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a very important election going on in Mexico. We have López Obrador, who is up 20 to 25 points. He's more of a nationalist. And I think the fact that he's up 20, 25 points is a direct result of what the rhetoric is coming out of the White House regarding trade, regarding the people. I don't know I just think it's not helpful once the election is over. How do you put this back together? Because it's going to impact both countries. And China, to me, is just waiting in the wings. So it's just foolish to be at this place now. And it's nice to be a nationalist and beat up the United States, but then you have the rhetoric coming from both sides. So it's just a terrible situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mr. Sierra, thank you for that very important question. And first, we have to see what the results actually are on July 1st before we declare the winner. But yes, Mr. López Obrador is ahead in the polls. And I think this would fundamentally change, or potentially fundamentally change, the relationship between the United States and Mexico. I would say that I think many, if not most, Mexican citizens will vote for president based on similar things that we might vote for in terms of their own economic conditions, their own security conditions, their hope for a better life for their families. But I agree with you that the rhetoric coming from north of the border is not helpful in that context. Absolutely right. One of the things that has made over the years NAFTA so powerful is not just the fact that it ordered the majority of trade in North America and investment, but it also created bumpers which allowed certain behaviors and beyond which certain behaviors were not allowed. And it was very powerful in the context in the 1990s, for example, when Mexico ran into trouble with its peso crisis, and some of the instincts of the political class in Mexico that would have closed down the Mexican economy, which would have been exactly counterproductive, were prevented by NAFTA, and Mexico's economy remained open, and they came back to global capital markets much sooner than they had during the previous crisis in the 1980s. I'm reviewing that history because NAFTA is precisely the tool that one would look to in this circumstance if Mr. López Obrador or anybody is elected in Mexico who might take a different view in terms of Mexico's relationship with the United States. The fact that we have a NAFTA organizes trade and investment, but also in a general way, the bilateral relationship in a way that channels some of the conflicts into ways that can actually be resolved. I think it would be a strategic mistake, therefore, to pull out of NAFTA, not just because it would hurt the United States, economically, but also because it would challenge our ability to keep that relationship with Mexico within the bounds that we might find mutually beneficial. So the question that you're raising, I think, is absolutely right, and I think we have to look at the tools that are available to us in the United States to help us build that relationship in a positive way and not pull back in a negative way.
You've raised a key question, Ranking Member Cedas, that not enough people are talking about. I think that the prospect of López Obrador presidency, as Eric said, polling is polling, but it's something I think we're watching carefully as the U.S. business community in terms of what the candidate says about his commitments. At this point, I think we are encouraged that I think his words on NAFTA have been relatively moderate. A concern we have going forward is respect for ongoing reforms in Mexico, in which many U.S. companies are deeply invested, specifically in telecommunications and energy. He has announced he'll pursue a review process for that. We don't know what that entails, but we're watching carefully and consulting with his advisors. I think in this space, though, in terms of, you ask an important question in terms of, and I think I want to answer this from the private sector role, in terms of irrespective of the two governments, we as the U.S. business community and the Mexican business community are 100% committed to this bilateral relationship. As my boss, Tom Donahue, said in Lima, and talking about the bilateral relationship, failure is not an option. It's a $500 billion a year bilateral trade balance. So we run the U.S.-Mexico CEO dialogue, in which we meet twice a year with CEOs and senior executives from a variety of companies to try and address the very issues in the bilateral relationship that are so imperative to keep the economic engine that is U.S.-Mexico trade going.
Oh, thank you. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask for your help, all three of you, to the extent you can, about a particularly egregious example of hostility to foreign direct investment in Guatemala and of judicial usurpation of the government's desire to promote economic growth. Tahoe Resources has invested $1.7 billion in a mine in Guatemala, and some court down there has decided that the permits that it has are invalid due to indigenous people's hostility, something which I'm used to in the Panama Canal debates years ago. This mine had thousands of Guatemalan employees, and they've laid off a great number of them, and they're about to terminate 500 more right now. Even the Bank of Guatemala and Jimmy Morales are trying to get the court to act. I'm going to call the court myself next week. We sent a letter, our committee, the chairman did, to President Morales, both urging him to support SICIG and Ivan Gonzalez work, as well as to implement the ILO conventions to give a more stable business environment and prevent bad things like this. So any advice you all might have, we would deeply appreciate. I'd like to read this in the record, too, the chairman's letter, if I could.
Thank you so much, Congressman Rooney. I mentioned Guatemala briefly in my remarks. I think that is definitely a country where we've seen repeated challenges with respect to rule of law. I do believe that there are some good intentions in the Guatemalan government to try to advance on that score. But to your point, I think doubling down on both bilateral and multilateral efforts to do tech training and to really help our allies within the Guatemalan government that see the benefit to addressing some of these challenges. We really need to build those folks up and give them the tools that they need to be sure that U.S. companies are able to favorably operate in the country, and fairly, more importantly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have any ideas? Eric, I figured you'd have some good ideas of how we can straighten out the court.
Well, Ambassador Rooney, with a setup like that, I'm not quite sure how to respond, but nonetheless, thank you for the question. I will confess to you that I'm not familiar with the merits of this particular issue, but as you've requested, I'll be happy to take a look at it and see if there are ideas that will come forward, and be happy to share that with you and your staff.
We would appreciate it, both you and the Chamber, because you'll have important voices for business. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I yield.
I'm happy to answer that question, Congressman Rui, if you want. I think, so we wrote a letter to President Morales last year on this issue, in part, in general, and covering rule of law issues writ large in Guatemala, but focused on this issue. Appreciated the letter that the committee sent to the chair and the ranking member, letter also to the president. We have, the ILO Convention 169 implementation in Guatemala, as the chair and the ranking member asserted, I think is what we have really been pushing hard for on the Guatemalan government. It's important. Really important within that is obviously a full respect for indigenous rights is imperative, but that there be within the convention a very robust consultative process that the private sector is able to participate in.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you too, I guess, for being here on this very important issue that we're discussing today. I agree with my colleague that although over the years there have been some conflicts with indigenous populations within Latin America, certainly what's happened with the land bonds in Peru, is just one example of how people were taken advantage of, and then ultimately that now the government is trying to make right, but at the same time, our constituents were impacted by the sale of these junk bonds. I hope that we are able to bring some relief to the firefighters, police officers, and truckers that I represent that have been impacted by that. Mr. Harrington, because of those conflicts, I have been working on a bill here in Congress, Jobs for Tribes, which creates a unique opportunity for American tribes to be able to work with indigenous populations of the Americas and trade in goods that they each either grow or make within their communities. What sort of opportunities do you see for Native American tribes to invest in Latin America?
I apologize for not being familiar with the merits of the bill. However, I will say at the Chamber, we're all about investment and commercial promotion between the U.S. and across the region. And anecdotally, I can tell you there's some really innovative things going on in ecotourism and other initiatives in primarily indigenous areas of the Americas. While I'm not a subject matter expert at the Chamber, we have a Native American Affairs group that deals with Native American economic affairs, and we'd be happy to come see you and talk about.
I would love to follow up with you on that issue. It's something that I've been working on very closely. It's a bipartisan bill that has enjoyed bipartisan support. And I like to see where we can find areas that we can work together to help create jobs, not only in these areas where we are seeing the most impact in our immigration system, but also in areas of the U.S. where we have seen that there is lack of opportunities for jobs. So matching those together, I think, is important. USAID is investing in a lot of these communities. We've seen projects where we are eradicating coca, for example, and planting chocolate cocoa. So how do we match those communities in South America, for example, the mining of silver and copper, and how can we match those indigenous communities with our tribes here to create an environment of manufacturing of goods that could benefit both ends of the spectrum. So I would love to follow up with you on that issue. Ms. Meeman, regarding CSIG, how do you see the government of Guatemala moving forward from your jobs perspective? Because I know that it has had a major impact in U.S. companies that are investing there. How does U.S. companies, how are they able to compete fairly in a place where public corruption is rampant?
No, it's a real challenge, and I would say, and I commented in my remarks, that U.S. companies obviously hold themselves to a very high ethical standard. You know, we've got FCPA, but beyond that, we just have a culture in our private sector that, you know, inherently, when we do invest, when our companies invest in foreign markets, be it Guatemala or wherever, typically that does kind of raise the tide in that market, just from a rule of law, transparency perspective. One challenge that I've seen and that I think that they're trying to grapple with in Guatemala right now is, you know, being sure that as large multinationals, U.S. multinationals are doing business in some of these smaller markets, Central America, et cetera, that professionalizing impact that they have is appreciated and that it is allowed to flourish. Because often, you know, obviously, if you're going to operate in a country, you're going to do partnerships and deals and contracts with local players who sometimes won't be at that same level. And so as you're, you know, as a U.S. company, putting your hand down to kind of, you know, raise that level to what would be expected for a U.S. multinational, there needs to be some latitude there, not a lack of enforcement, not any sort of ethical flexibility, but I think that there needs to be a construct that allows that to happen without the U.S. company running a risk of getting blamed, if you will. And that is something I've seen, and it's something that I do worry about in the Central American context. But I do think, again, that it's something through the work that's being done bilaterally and multilaterally, it can definitely be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Gilley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the tensions between our nation and some of our neighbors with respect to increasing tariffs, this is such a timely and critical conversation. With respect to Canada, for example, President Trump has recently stated that Canadian steel and aluminum and Canada itself are now national security threats to the United States. I'm very concerned because I represent a district which is urban, suburban, and rural, and it's home to numerous steel mills, farms, and service industry-based companies, which in turn employ hundreds of thousands of my constituents. I'm concerned about the long-term employment and economic implications of imposing higher tariffs. There are reports that upwards of 400,000 jobs would be lost across agricultural, services, and manufacturing and energy sectors if these tariffs are imposed. The question for any of you to address, do you believe, as the President said, that Canada poses a national security risk to the United States? And do you agree with President Trudeau that President Trump's starting of a trade war with Canada is actually insulting?
Congressman Kelly, if I can begin the dialogue here, in part because I'm originally from Illinois, and so I wanted to have the opportunity to respond to your question. Thank you, exactly. But thank you for that important question. In a word, no, Canada is not a national security threat to the United States. Canada is a strategic ally of the United States. Canada is a country with which we have trade disputes and have had trade disputes for years because our economy is fully integrated with Canada, and the more integrated you are, the more disputes you're naturally going to have. But what makes the relationship with Canada so strong is that we share values, including the rule of law. And so when we enter into trade disputes, we have a process by which we can resolve them. And what the recent actions have done is gone outside of that process and begun to take unilateral actions in a way that, from my perspective, are unhelpful to the broader bilateral relationship. That's one side. But the other side that you've pointed to quite accurately, in my view, is what will be the impact on the U.S. economy. Canada and strategic relations and NATO and border cooperation, all that in one basket, but the other basket, what's it going to mean for the United States and job creation in the United States? And I am very sensitive to the idea that people in some parts of our country are hurting, and they do have questions about sustainability of jobs in industry, and that is a powerful and important issue, and we cannot ignore it, and I know that the members of this subcommittee do not. But from my perspective, the way to address that is not to favor one or another sector that will have the implication of disadvantaging other sectors and where the negative implications of the action will actually be greater than the positive implications. And so there is a cost-benefit analysis. There is a balance, in my view, that has to be struck. And I think you're pointing to something that's very, very important. Having said that, even if we were to pull back from the determination that was recently made that Canada is a strategic or national security threat, I should say, to the United States, we are doing damage to our relationship. And it's not going to be easy to restore that, even if today we were to decide that, in fact, Canada is not a national security threat to the United States, which it's not. But my point is that as these bricks in the wall begin to build up, you begin to have an understanding from other countries that, in fact, they're questioning the reliability of the United States as a partner. And once that happens, they begin to look for other partners. And we're seeing that happen right now in Latin America, and right now in Canada. And the whole idea that China could replace the United States as the partner of choice in Latin America, to me, is astounding.
Right.
And in my view, not accurate, but nonetheless, something that's absolutely happening right now.
Thank you. I just wondered if you guys had comments. And as you're commenting, you could think about this. How do you think these actions impact, I might have missed, you might have said it already, the NAFTA negotiations? That's the other piece.
It absolutely puts a chill on the NAFTA negotiations. And beyond that, to have the 1-2 punch of then initiating another 232 national security investigation on autos, which in the history of not just the 232 statute, which comes from this Trade Expansion Act of 1962, but even going back to the national security exception in the GATS, post-World War II time era, we have never done a 232 national security case on a completely finished good like autos in the history of the trade policy of this country. And so to call our good allies, which if you buy into the argument that deficits matter, which I personally do not, but this administration does, we even have a $2 billion trade surplus, as I said, with Canada on these items. And then you extrapolate that into an item such as automobiles, which I think very clearly, and I'll be fascinated to see the position of Secretary Mattis on this regard, because he will have to weigh in. I think that at that point, we really are damaging our credibility as a negotiating partner to an extent that it's going to be very difficult to recuperate.
Yeah, Ford is my biggest employer.
If you you have the Chicago Assembly Plant, I believe, in your district. Is that correct?
That what?
You have the Chicago Assembly Plant in your district. Is that right, too? So on that note, and on Kelly gave me the perfect segue. So if I could quote Tom Donahue on 232.4. Now this is obviously for autos and auto parts, the announcement of the commencement of a study. But I think he would okay me,
Sir,
saying the same thing on the other.
Your time has expired. Thank you. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman Cook, and appreciate you holding this very important hearing, and Ranking Member Sears. I'm chairing my own hearing, so I can't stay. It was on Vietnam human rights. With respect to Ecuador, I am concerned that American companies have often been treated unfairly by the Ecuadorian judicial system. For example, in the case of Merck, a U.S. pharmaceutical company, I understand there is a partial final award of the International Arbitral Tribunal that ruled Merck had been denied justice in the Ecuadorian legal system. I wonder if you could tell us, any of our distinguished witnesses, what actions are being taken in Ecuador to ensure that the award of the arbitral tribunal is respected by the Ecuadorian judicial system, and that no further steps are taken locally to enforce the justice-denying rulings of the Ecuadorian courts. Yes, sir. Mr. Harrington?
Yeah, I'm happy to address Congressman. The legacy of the Correa regime, the previous regime in Ecuador, is troubling, to say the least. There were very few protections for rule of law. Certainly, many of our members, Merck being certainly one of them, were challenged deeply by some of the policies of that regime. I would say that we are quite encouraged, frankly, and I know the committee staff took a trip to Ecuador last week, so I'm interested in their thoughts eventually too, after the hearing. We're encouraged with the steps, the commitments that President Lenín Moreno, the new president, has made in the areas of investor protections. Ecuador has certainly embraced the fact that foreign direct investment is a key source of economic development. That's what we're seeing initially, but there's a long way to go. He's got a lot of legacy issues to clear up. The arbitration issue that I think you accurately put your finger on is absolutely essential. That if they're going to continue to show progress and show that they're serious about making Ecuador a more attractive destination for foreign investment, that would be an excellent next step to take.
I appreciate that. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add very, very briefly, I concur that Ecuador has taken some very interesting steps under the new government, and we applaud that. In this particular case, I think there is room for the United States to encourage Ecuador to live up to the terms of the bilateral investment treaty that Ecuador has with the United States, and to live up to any sort of arbitral awards that may be made under that treaty. I think that is something that we would encourage, frankly, across the region. Once companies enter into arbitration with host governments, if there are judgments made, judgments need to be respected.
Appreciate that very much, and thank you for your answers and for your advocacy. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith. I'm now going to turn back to Congressman Sears. We had some time. I was trying to include this, so do the balancing act. So I recognize the ranking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harrington, can you just finish what you would, and I'll ask you the question afterwards. Thank you, Chairman.
I'm going to quote my boss, so I better get it right. I think it's important to talk to, on Section 232, this is specific to autos and the auto parts. Obviously, the announcement that the Department of Commerce would commence a study on applying 232 also to autos and auto parts. My boss said just last week, to your question, Congresswoman, this isn't about national security. The administration has already signaled its true objective is to leverage this tariff threat in trade negotiations with Mexico, Canada, Japan, the European Union, and South Korea. These allies provide nearly all U.S. auto imports and are among America's closest partners. Neither they nor these imports endanger our national security in any way. So I think that speaks for itself.
You know, in my office, I'm from New Jersey. I get a lot of pharmaceutical companies in my office constantly complaining about Canada. So one of the things that I was happy about is at least we're raising the issue that there are some differences or discrepancies. You know, where do you see when they negotiate this NAFTA that the pharmaceutical industry fits in? Because we're getting, in New Jersey, it's hurting New Jersey. And if the president can include that in his negotiations, I think the pharmaceutical industry in New Jersey would appreciate what the Canadians are doing. You might want to say a couple of things that the Canadians.
Maybe I'll just start quickly, if I may, Ranking Member Sears. I think I've participated in a number of the NAFTA rounds, and I know there hasn't been around for a while, but you know, back when there was, the U.S. would try to raise intellectual property, would try to raise market access, and the response, I think somewhat understandably, from Mexico and Canada was, why would we want to talk about intellectual property? That's something that's important to you, United States of America, when you have on the table a removal of investor-state dispute settlement, a government procurement policy that goes against our interests, counter-seasonal AD/CVD, sunset clause, all of the, as they're called, poison pill provisions that the United States has had on the table have really prevented us as a country, prevented our negotiators from getting to those items like intellectual property rights protection that are very much in the U.S. interest.
Sounds like an excuse to me.
It's, you know, it's an excuse that's too easy for them to make, I guess,
That's
would
what
be
I
my
mean.
concern, you know?
Mr. Harrington?
Yes, thank you, Ranking Member Sears. To your point, Canada does not have IP standards commensurate with its status as a developed economy, nor as a hub of innovation, which it is. And its standards need to be certainly heightened because of that. I think NAFTA, I think Kelly touched on a lot of the core here, that we have these opportunities in the NAFTA space for offensive interests. And this is truly, along with a few other areas in the bilateral U.S.-Canadian relationship, including dairy issues. Some folks have certainly issues with the way Canada operates its dairy market, that the U.S. has legitimate offensive interests that are frankly being held hostage to these very unconventional proposals that the U.S. has put forward in government procurement, the sunset clause, the dispute resolution suite of chapters 11, 19, and 20, et cetera, the rules of origin, obviously. So I would just leave it right there, that the IP chapter actually is not yet, it hasn't really even been put on the table because of these issues.
I got 52 seconds.
I won't take that long. But if you bring the lens out a little bit further, one of the most powerful ways to help the United States address some of the legitimate concerns with China on intellectual property is to have a unified North America. And that's what NAFTA would allow us to do if we were to come to agreement on intellectual property, as well as the other issues we've been talking about. That would give us a far wider and deeper platform from which to address some of the issues that we face with China.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for being late. Thank you for being here and for your testimony. I chair the Asia Pacific Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, along with being on this one. And I just find our relationships in the Western Hemispheres, we need to increase, and we need to show a strong force coming out of the United States. Business, security, all those things. And I know with the chairman here, he focuses on the same things that we do. You know, we want economics, trade, national security issues. And I think it's imperative that we work through these committees to generate policies that make us stronger for our allies and our relationships. And we introduced the BUILD Act, which, as you know, I heard you talk about OPIC and how important and valuable that tool is. Well, with the BUILD Act, what we've done is we've expanded the lending capacity up to from $23 billion up to $60 billion. In addition, we can partner up with private enterprises and work and leverage that capital that they have along with the expertise they have, and we can lend in foreign currency, which we weren't able to do before, and then we can partner up with foreign countries. How do you feel that we can best utilize a vehicle like that to build projects in these countries? Mr. Farnsworth, if you want to try to tackle that.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate both the opportunity to respond and also your and other leadership on this important act. I think it's a very important recognition that other countries are using tools, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, which we simply don't have, and we need to increase our authorities to be able to do that. One of the key areas that Latin America and the Caribbean needs, and where the United States has great expertise, is in infrastructure. And yet we've been losing this battle in some ways to China, because China has a tool that we have not been able to mobilize in the same way, and that's development finance. China comes not just with projects, but they come with the finance to be able to do the projects. OPIC has been a successful agency in my view, but it's been limited. It's small and its authorities are limited. So what the BUILD Act does, it expands that, gives us the ability to compete more effectively with the China bag of money, if you want to put it that way. What's important about that aspect is not simply, though, the commercial aspect. If you talk to many regional leaders and business people, they would prefer a relationship, they would prefer the investment from the United States because of management, because of quality, because of technology, because of anti-corruption, things that they're not necessarily getting from China. But if China's the only game in town, they have to be the partner, not the preferred partner. They're the only partner. So this gives us an opportunity to get back in the game, and I want to simply acknowledge that and say that this could be a very important tool if the Congress passes it soon.
I appreciate it. Ms. Harrington, you want to weigh in on that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman Yoho. I think the U.S. Chamber is a big supporter of this bill. I think we have advocated, one of the things we've advocated in my written testimony is for an inclusive all of U.S. government approach to supporting our exporters and our companies that do business in the region. I think that this is what the BUILD Act does, and I commend you and others who are involved in that. I think, and the best part about this is it's a free service to U.S. taxpayers, right? And I think to companies, and I think that a key issue, obviously, we're talking about today is Chinese influence in the region, and one of the ways that China China is able to successfully insert itself into our region is through basically a state-owned enterprise financing,
Right.
state financing, and our companies can no longer fight with one arm tied behind their back. So I commend you for advancing this legislation.
Well, I appreciate it. Ms. Hawk, you have anything to add?
Might be a bit off topic since it's OPIC, but just to endorse also returning EXIM to full functionality. That's something that we're seeing again and again, coming up against Chinese Development Bank financing,
Right.
et cetera. So,
And that was
thank
the
you.
whole purpose of doing this, because we had to have something to counter that. And if we're not leading in that area, and if we can't compete, there's a vacuum created, and nature abhors a vacuum, and that gets filled by somebody. And we want to make sure it's somebody that values the values we do. And with the Western Hemisphere, we want to make sure that they're people that are going to promote democracies and, the values that we do. And so we felt this was a very important issue to do. One last thing on energy. We're blessed with an abundance of energy in the United States of America, and we're exporting now. And we've got bills on the floor to increase the amount of LNG. And this is something we feel very critical to send down to the Western Hemisphere, to the Caribbean Basin, and have it as an alternative to number 2 diesel coming out of Venezuela, which is not a friendly regime. And Mr. Chairman, I'm over my time, and I'm going to yield back and tell you I appreciate it. But that's what we're working on, and thank you.
Thank you very much. We're joined by 2 more members from New York. They were late. They were watching reruns of the Mets and the Yankees. I understand their priorities, but right now I'm going to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espiat.
Thank you, Chairman Cook. And the world looks different from up here, right? I'm usually down there in the southern part of the hemisphere. But thank you for what you have contributed to this debate. And I also want to sort of like ask some questions about China. And then the Secretary of State was here last week, and I told him, they're eating our candy. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a vacuum of leadership there. And of course, China has come in, and you began to see countries break from Taiwan, the most recent, the Dominican Republic, a couple of weeks ago. And China is coming into the hemisphere, and they're coming in to do public projects and roads and bridges and loans and investment, and there's a strong push to replace us as a main partner, even though they're so far away geopolitically. It's a whole different continent, but they're making a strong argument to take over or have a strong influence in the region. And so what are the main obstacles? Is corruption a real obstacle for U.S. companies to continue to invest? La mordida, the bite, they call it, right? In some countries, they say it's as high as 30%. And of course, no country that, especially since we have very strong anti-corruption laws here that are enforced, is that a major problem in investment?
Well, if I could try my hand, Congressman, at responding. First, the positive story about China in the region. They buy a lot of products from the region, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. And in the recession of 2008, 2009, it was actually China that kept Latin America from falling itself into recession. There's legitimate trade, there's legitimate investment. So that is something that I think we should frankly celebrate, because we're not buying all those products, and there's no reason why Latin America shouldn't have the opportunity to sell to other markets worldwide. Having said that, there are broad implications of that, both for U.S. business and also, frankly, for the promotion of the U.S. Strategic interest in the Western Hemisphere. And I think we've seen that develop over the last 10 or 15 years, which is really the time period that China's been directly engaged in the Western Hemisphere. Is it a question fundamentally about corruption? Corruption plays a part. There's no question about it. China's not subject to FCPA. Chinese companies aren't necessarily listed on the New York Stock Exchange. You don't have the same transparency and regulatory requirements, et cetera. So that is an issue. But if you talk to U.S. companies, that's not necessarily the first thing that they raise. in terms of their ability to compete. They really do raise the issue of development finance and the ability of Chinese companies to come in with financing at below market rates from the Chinese government. They do raise the issue of Chinese ability to underbid U.S. companies, because many of the Chinese companies are state-owned enterprises, they have government support, et cetera. They may not be bidding even at market prices. They might be taking a loss in order to get the contract and get the investment and move forward that way. There are a myriad number of other things. One of the other things that may be retarding the United States' ability to move forward in the region is the ability of the United States to support some of those efforts from the private sector side, the U.S. government. And we've been talking about that a little bit to this point. And I think the ability to ramp up commercial diplomacy at the very senior levels of the U.S. government would really, really help and show that Latin America, that the United States is not just here on a transactional basis or a commercial basis, but we are here on a partnership basis. And that really goes a long way in terms of the Western Hemisphere. What, in some ways, we used to do, I think we've gotten away from that a little bit. I'd like to see that go forward in a similar way.
And finally, you know, I spoke to a former president of a Latin American country, and he said to me, well, show me real U.S. investment in the hemisphere, you know, that's significant right now in the last 20 years. Even the banks are no longer there. And, you know, I sort of began to think, and he was absolutely right. I think that we need to invest, Mr. Chairman, more in the future of Latin America and come back to ensure that we continue to be their main partner. So thank you for your testimonies.
Thank you very much. And at this time, I'd like to recognize another congressman from New York, my good friend, the gentleman from New York, Congressman Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of pick up from where Mr. Espaillat just left off. First, when I think about CAFTA and, of course, then NAFTA, at one time we were trying to do something in regards to a trade deal with all of the Americas, and even TPP, where we had various countries in Central and South America that would have been a part of that. TPP being important because it also kind of put a check on China, you know, to make sure that they're playing by the rules, et cetera. So it's extremely important. Can you tell me what you think would have been the negative or the positive effects of if we had stayed in the TPP, and whether CAFTA is increasing the investments and opportunities for American companies and improving the relationship with those on the hemisphere?
Thank you, Congressman Meeks. I think you raise an excellent issue. I think the U.S. Chamber was a very vocal supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and I think you correctly call out a key reason why it was important, which was to establish a Trans-Pacific trading system that's rules-based, that where the U.S. exerts its leadership on trade, joined by like-minded, free market-oriented economies, in the effort to try and encourage the same sort of adoption of policies across Asia and other parts of Latin America that weren't necessarily involved. The other key thing, though, I think that's really important about TPP is, you know, our exporters look to us every day, and NAFTA obviously is their priority, but they say to us across, name your sector, manufacturing, agriculture, they're very focused on Asia. Why? Because we project by the year 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle-class consumers will be in Asia. So when we talk to this administration following the announcement to withdraw from TPP, our question is, okay, what's your strategy to access these consumers that our exporters will desperately need in the future to continue growing?
So let me then add, and I presume here when you're late, you don't know when oil prior to you getting here, but I have now likewise concerns in regards to what is taking place with the tariffs that the president is currently placing on there, and love to get your take on the impact of these newly imposed tariffs will have on American jobs and businesses, both small and large, in our country. And then with the retaliations that some of our allies are talking about. I'd like to get your perspective, Mr. Farnsworth.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is the key question. It's the framing question for how do you promote U.S. commerce and business in the region. But the overall framework is an atmosphere that is roiled, as a word I used in my oral testimony, by the steel tariffs that we've seen against Canada and Mexico and Europe and others, and voluntary export restraints that Brazil and Argentina have had to comply with in the steel context. But also in terms of the very aggressive approach the United States has taken on NAFTA, which is not clear if the United States even wants to continue with NAFTA. That is a real issue in the terms of sustainability for investors. The pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you also alluded to, we could go on perhaps in some other issues. But this is a circumstance where once the United States was the country that was actually creating the conditions for orderly business and commerce in the region, now we've become the primary disruptor. And the problem with that is that if you're an investor looking in the long term, you can't make decisions based on that because there's uncertainty, but it also provides the conditions that an outside country like China, which we've been talking about, but there are others as well, can come in and take advantage, particularly if the state is behind some of these investments, as we've been talking about in the context of Chinese investments in the region. So from my perspective, this is unhelpful, but despite that, there are other issues as well. Even if, as I mentioned previously in the testimony, even if the United States were to change course today and were to have a policy shift today on trade, the damage that's being done is going to take a long time to overcome. Supply chains, once they develop elsewhere, cannot just be unwound. They're built, they're developed over years. If other countries begin to look for partners that don't include the United States, whether because of formal trade relationships or some other reason, or just the question about the sustainability of the relationship with the United States, they begin to develop those relations with other countries. And once those are developed, they're really tough and very expensive to break. So I think we have to be very, very careful. We can be doing these as negotiation issues, or we can be doing them because perhaps we believe in them, but nonetheless, there are consequences that go well beyond the United States as well. And the final thing I would say, and just concurring with my two colleagues on the panel as well, is that there are economic consequences to the United States. This will hurt the U.S. economy. And from the job creation perspective and from the ability to grow the economy even after tax reform and some of the other things that have been done over the recent months, from my perspective, this will be a step back for U.S. economic interests.
Thank you. Out of time.
Thank you very much. One further piece of business, if there is no objection, I'd like to enter into the congressional record testimony from Transparency International. I want to thank, pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee would be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, their hearing record will remain open for 5 business days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I did want to add, this has been kind of a crazy day. I think everybody knows that. Ranking member was saying it's like a fly-in day. People are coming in, hot seating it, and then leaving from one committee, and I want to apologize. We were a little late because of votes. It's that time of year. We're going to be in, I think the second series of votes is at 9 o'clock, 2100 for all the military folks out there. So I certainly appreciate your flexibility. It's great to have a committee here that is so engaging, and I try to get everybody. And right now, just a reminder, we have a little meeting with the president of Honduras afterwards. But once again, it was I can't thank you enough for being here. And there being no further business, these guys can get back to their Yankee games or New Jersey. Or being no further, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.